I'm going to explain why the 6 days of creation do not tell us the absolute beginning of all physical material on Earth. Genesis 1 is without a doubt one of the most controversial verses in the Bible, and I understand that some people do not think that it should be controversial at all. But what does the Bible actually say, and what kind of biblical evidence can we see in the text itself to help us to understand what's actually being said? I want to propose that there are several evidences inside of Genesis 1 that help show why we should not think that the 6 days of creation are dealing with an absolute time, beginning, and a physical earth. The first evidence of this is that Genesis 1 through 2, the first two verses, they say, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was void and formless. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters of the deep. And then God said, 'Let there be light,' and he separated the light from the darkness." You notice that little, "and then God said"? Each day of the 6 days of creation begins with, "and God said," and then it ends with, "and there was evening and morning." That seems to be a very consistent pattern throughout the 6 days of creation. This actually shows a marker where it is marking the first day as being verse 3, where God separates the light from the darkness. If God separates the light from the darkness on day 1, then what was this emptiness, void, darkness, and waters mentioned in verse 2? Verse 1 and 2 are separate from day 1. They're separate from day 1, and we need to see the patterns that are being used in Genesis chapter 1 to notice why they shouldn't be counted as the first day. You see, where we see structure, design, complexity, we should infer that a mind was behind it and did so intentionally. And that's what we see in Genesis chapter 1. There are several indicators that show patterns in Genesis 1. The first one was the one I just mentioned. It's got a structure that it begins with God saying, and it ends with evening and morning. Let me give you a couple other examples, though, to help prove this point and to show why we should think of day 1 as in verse 3. One other such example would be the structure of each of the days. You see, when we look at Genesis, we see day 1 starting with the separation of light and darkness, and then day 4 actually talking about the sun, moon, and stars. So here's the light and darkness, the sun, moon, and stars. Then on day 2, we have the separation of the waters above and the waters below. And then we have the birds of the air and the fish of the sea. And then on day 3, we have the separation from the land and the water. And here we see the filling in with the land animals and mankind. And so each one of the days match up evenly. 1 and 4, 2 and 5, and 3 and 6. Now, in and of itself, that may not quite be enough to be super compelling. But one of the other aspects that continues to show this is that it shows an idea of a creative act in each one of the days, with a double day on day 3 and a double blessing on day 6. And so again, we continue to see symmetry in each one of these types of ideas. Next, we move on to Hebrew and how Hebrew can help us to understand Genesis 1 better. Hebrew has something that is called a vav consecutive. It's a little letter known as vav, and it goes in the beginning of verbs. And it begins as a prefix. And what it does is it shows sequences or connections between verbs. And in Genesis 1, there's a vav consecutive that begins in verse 3 and goes all the way throughout the 6 days of creation, but it's completely absent from the first 2 verses. This continues to show us that in Hebrew, the Hebrew writer was intentionally leaving out the first 2 days and grouping together the 6 days of creation in a way that makes it more clear what's being talked about. Now, this should add on to our arguments that we can see the writer has in mind the first day of creation being in verse 3. Now, there's one more piece to this that's extremely important, and that is the fact that Genesis 1, verse 2, is the cornerstone or the context for all of the days of creation. If you read the chapter, every day goes back to verse 2. For example, why did God separate the light and darkness on day 1? Well, because there was darkness over the surface of the waters. Well, then why does he separate the waters below and the waters above? Because there was formlessness. That's the same reason he separates the waters from the land. The earth was formless. And this is also what we see. Well, why does God create the land animals? Because the earth is empty and void. Every single one of the days of creation is going back to the context of verse 2. This creates a different kind of problem. Some people want to say that verses 1 and 2 are a summary statement. And so, in other words, it's more of a summary statement as to what's happening or going to happen instead of something that's already happened in the past. This doesn't really seem to work because each one of the days is calling back to the fact that there already is an earth, water, and darkness based on verse 2. And so if verse 2 hasn't actually materialized in any meaningful sense, then there's nothing for the rest of the days to correspond to. But the text seems to assume that this has already taken place, and now the text is explaining how it connects or interacts with verse 2. That's why it's so important that we read the text carefully and notice the context are the first 2 verses, and the rest of the 6 days of creation are all going back to those first 2 verses. So all of the patterns are meaningful because it shows that there was an earth, darkness, and matter, waters, before the first day of the 6 days of creation. And some people think that, well, why can't the first 2 verses just be the first day of creation? As I've shown, if the first 2 verses are part of day 1, it simply breaks the symmetry and pattern of the entire chapter. It's very inadvisable for us to go against what seems like a clearly designed structure to Genesis 1. And if we're going to go against a particular structure, we better have very, very good reasons. But all of the reasons lean towards the idea that the author is extremely intentional in telling us that the state of the world, the earth, was that the earth was void and formless and that there was darkness. That's how we begin day 1. And we have to be able to show and explain how all of this is working together, because the patterns are not an accident. So what this means is that we don't really know, based on Genesis chapter 1, how old the earth is. Because what Genesis 1 is telling us is that there was already matter, water, and darkness prior to day 1, in which case we don't know when it was created at all. This is not entirely unusual in the sense that Genesis 1 is not referring to the creation of all things. Now, I'm a little bit careful when I say that. What I mean is we have an excellent example of something that is clearly not mentioned in Genesis 1. The angels. The angels are not mentioned in the creation account at all. But in fact, Job does mention this idea. In fact, I believe Job suggests that the angels were present at creation. They were there celebrating it as God was bringing things together. And this is how we should understand the angels. The reason the angels aren't mentioned is because it's not about them. Genesis 1 is focused around the creation of the earth, and it is finally culminated in mankind and establishing mankind being made in God's image to carry out God's dominion on the earth. That's the goal. That's what we're seeing in Genesis chapter 1. If it was to establish mankind's rule and dominion over the angels, you better believe they would have been mentioned. But they aren't mentioned because man is not supposed to rule over the angels. The angels are a completely separate thing. And therefore, we don't know when the angels were created either. Now, I know some people have posited the idea, well, maybe they were just created outside of time. I don't really think this makes any sense. Created is a tensed verb. It entails that it was made, created, activated in time, sometime in the past. What does it mean to have something created outside of time? I don't know, because it doesn't seem to make any sense. Instead, God creates, but he does so inside of time. Whenever the first moment of creation was, rather it was angel or earth or universe or anything at all, there must be time present in order for God to act. And so this is not the beginning of everything. And I don't think that it is even telling us when God created the physical material earth. And one other question to kind of end on that note. On what day did God create water? Yeah, if you want, you can look up in your Bibles and try and find it. The truth is, he doesn't ever mention it. He separates the waters above and the waters below, but he doesn't say that he manifested them into material creation on day 2, nor does he say that on day 3. In which case, what happened to the water? The water was already there. It tells us in verse 2, and therefore we should conclude that God made it as far as material creation sometime in the past. The only difficulty is we don't know when in the past. And I know there's probably a lot more questions left, but leave those questions in the comments and I'll be sure to see if we can address them either later or maybe in one of my debates.